Guys, Dan Hackett here, dual Australian and UAE licensed financial advisor, providing financial advice to Australian expats both here in the UAE and around the globe. Today I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce to you my new blog series, the first of which is going to be talking about the all-important topic of Australian tax residency and what you need to do to ensure that you remain a non-resident for tax purposes. Now, as my blog talks about in further detail, it is a lot more difficult than people think. People think that it's simply where are you living. If you're living outside of Australia, then you're a non-resident. But as my blog explains in further detail, there are in fact 4 tests that determine your tax residency and whether or not you'll be taxed on your overseas earnings. So the first test is what we call the resides test. Now, this is the primary test in determining your Australian tax residency status. As you would imagine, the word resides in this particular context simply relates to where you are living. So if you're living outside of Australia, that's where you ordinarily reside, then you fail this test and your tax residency status will be determined by the remaining 3 secondary tests. Now, yes, I said failing. So failing is in fact a good thing in this instance. We don't want to pass, we want to fail. So the first secondary test, if you want to put it that way, is what's called the 183-day rule test. Now, this test pertains to how many days are you spending in Australia during a given tax year. So if you're spending 183 days back in Australia, regardless of whether or not you're ordinarily residing overseas, you'll still be considered an Australian tax resident and would be taxed on your overseas earnings. So if you're spending less than 183 days of a tax year in Australia, you would fail this test and it would go to the remaining 2 secondary tests. So the second secondary test is what we call the superannuation test. Now, the superannuation test pertains to whether or not your employer is obligated to pay you superannuation. So a perfect example of this would be, say, an embassy worker. So they might be residing over here in the UAE or elsewhere, so they fail that test. They might spend less than 183 days of a tax year in Australia, so they fail that test, but their employer, being the embassy, being an Australian government agency, is required to pay them superannuation, and thus they would pass this test and be considered an Australian tax resident. So assuming that you don't work for an employer that is obligated to pay you your superannuation guarantee contribution, then your tax residency would go to the very last test, as we'll talk about in a second. So last but not least, we have the domicile test. Now, the domicile test is probably the most difficult of all the residency tests. It's the banana skin that people often and do slip up on in relation to their tax residency. Now, the word domicile in this particular context simply relates to your behavior and whether or not you're still acting as if Australia is the center of your universe. So to put this in further context for you, if you might be residing over here in the UAE or elsewhere, you might not spend more than 183 days of a tax year back in Australia. Your employer might not be obligated to pay you superannuation. But if you're still acting as if Australia is the center of your universe, in other words, you're keeping ties to Australia still, then the ATO may deem your domicile to still be that of Australia and thus consider you to be a tax resident of Australia. So as you can probably already gather from this particular test, it's very grey. It's very much a weight of case scenario whereby the ATO will weigh up all your behaviours on one side that say you're a domicile of Australia versus all your behaviours on the other side that say you're a non-domicile. And whichever holds more weight, that is basically the way that they will determine. Now, some specific examples of how you might meet this particular test can include whether or not your family is remaining in Australia, particularly if you've got any dependent children. That's a big red flag to the ATO. Another one is whether or not you're renting your house out. If you're keeping your family home back in Australia unrented, that is a big red flag again to the ATO and a sign that you actually intend to move back into that house at some point in the future. It's actually, the onus is on you to show the ATO that you're cutting ties with Australia and intend to leave indefinitely. So now, assuming you've cut ties with Australia, you can demonstrate all your behaviours that show that you've set up a place of abode here in the UAE or elsewhere, then you will hopefully fail this particular test and then be considered a non-resident, and you won't be taxed on your overseas earnings, which I'm sure will be a relief to many of you. Anyway, guys, I hope that you've found this beneficial. If there's any other topic you want me to cover, please let me know. I'd love to talk about it. There is more detail, of course, on this particular topic in my blog, so please go and give that a read. Anyway, till next time, take care, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.